All right, we're going to talk about the two elements of a complete sentence. An English sentence only needs two things to be an English sentence, and we're going to look at what they are. Then we're going to look at all the other stuff that shows up in English sentences anyway. We're going to do a few examples, and then we're going to look at rules for subjects and rules for predicates. And we're going to end, as we very often do, with a round of practice. All right. A complete grammatical English sentence only needs two elements in order to be a complete grammatical English sentence. That's it. As long as it has those two things included or implied, it's a sentence, it's all good. Now, the first thing a sentence needs is a subject, someone or something to perform the action in the sentence. The subject is what the sentence is all about. Now, in some special cases, the subject is implied and therefore doesn't have to be written out. We'll look at that in a minute. Subjects are always nouns, that's persons, places, or things, or ideas, or pronouns, which are shorter words that stand in for nouns, or things that act like them, so gerund verbs that are doing the job of a noun. We'll look at all of that. The other thing that a sentence needs is what's called a predicate, an action for the subject to perform. The core of a predicate is a verb, which is a word that indicates an action or a state of being, although predicates may be simple or quite complex. So predicates can be very short, they can be very long, but they always have to have a verb and they have to say what the subject of the sentence is doing. And here's a really important thing, subjects and verbs in English in the same sentence must agree in number. If you have a singular subject, you need a singular verb. Plural subject, plural verb. All right. Other stuff that shows up in English sentences. Other stuff that can show up in a sentence but doesn't really affect the main subject and verb too much includes phrases. That includes adverbial phrases, prepositional phrases, and so on. Clauses, which are a phrase is a group of words. A clause is a group of words that contains its own subject and verb, and we have entire lessons on those. Subordinate clauses tend to pop up in this sort of thing. Parenthetical statements and other asides. And interjections like ouch and hey. So all this stuff can show up in a sentence, but they're not really part of the essential nature of the sentence. So when you're looking for the main subject and verb, you can usually cross this stuff out. All right, so here are a few examples of grammatical English sentences. All children, with one exception, grow up. In the first sentence, the subject is children. With one exception is a prepositional phrase, so we can cross that out. And grow up is the predicate. Henry V led his troops at the Battle of Agincourt. The verb is led, so the predicate is led his troops at the Battle of Agincourt. Now, at the battle and of Agincourt are both prepositional phrases, so you knew you weren't going to find the verb there. Now let's take a look at the question. Did you see Marcus yesterday? Take a good look. Can you figure out the subject? That's right. It's you. You are the one being asked. You are the one who may or may not have seen Marcus. The verb is did see, and it's split apart because you very often do that in questions. Marcus is the direct object, and while he's important, he's not going to be the subject or the verb. And yesterday is just an adverb. We can leave it out if we're looking for the main subject and verb. All right. From the treetops came the sound of birdsong. This sentence has an inverted subject-verb order. Normally in English, the subject comes before the verb, but sometimes if we're feeling especially poetic or just feel like messing with our readers, we will invert them. So from the treetops is a prepositional phrase. Came is a verb, but what came? What did the coming? Well, that would be sound. So sound of birdsong would be the complete subject, and came from the treetops would actually be the complete predicate. Abraham Lincoln, subject, was verb, the 16th President of the United States. So the complete predicate would be all of that. And finally, where did I leave my keys? The subject is I. Did leave is the verb, and everything else is just filler, at least if you're looking for the essential sentence. All right, let's look at some rules for how to use subjects. A subject will come before a phrase beginning with of. Of is a preposition. A prepositional phrase always needs what's called an object of a preposition, which is the thing after the of, but any given subject in a sentence will usually come before the of phrase. So, for example, a bouquet of sunflowers is a popular decoration. Bouquet is the subject. Why? Because the verb is. Very often, if you're trying to find the subject and verb in a sentence, it helps to find the verb first and then ask, who does this? So is our verb. The complete predicate is a popular decoration. Well, what is a popular decoration? That would be a bouquet. Of sunflowers is a prepositional phrase, so we can just ignore it. Next, it's possible for a sentence to have multiple subjects. So, a bouquet of sunflowers and a good book will make me happy any day. Well, again, let's start by finding the verb, and that would be will make. Well, what will make me happy any day? Well, that would be a bouquet of sunflowers and a good book. That's two things, but they're both performing the action of the verb will make, so we have what's called a compound subject. Next, a request or command, what's called an imperative sentence, has an implied subject, you. There's no need to write out this subject. So, whether we say, bring me those flowers, or open that book, or simply stop, all of those sentences have a subject, but the subject isn't written down. Because if you look at bring me those flowers, well, bring is obviously going to be the verb, but what have you got for a subject? Well, it's not me, because me is receiving the bringing. I'm sitting here waiting for you to bring me my flowers. So obviously, the person I'm addressing, you, would be the subject. So if you ever have to diagram a sentence, put you in parentheses and underline it, because that's your subject. Similarly, open that book. Hey, you, person I'm talking to, you, open that book. And finally, this is how you can get perfectly grammatical one-word English sentences. Stop. I'm talking to you. I don't need to say you. I just say, stop. I'm pointed at you. I must be talking to you. And I've got my verb, and therefore I have my complete sentence. All right. Now let's look at the rules for verbs. First, if a verb follows to, it is an infinitive and not the main verb of the sentence. An infinitive is never, ever, 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 ever going to be a main verb. It just isn't. Sometimes it will do the job of a noun, sometimes it will do other things or be part of a verb phrase, but it will never be the main verb. Period. A to infinitive verb phrase may fall before or after the main verb. So, for example, I love to cook. I is the subject, love is the verb, to cook is the direct object. I could just as easily say I love cooking, or I love fruit, or whatever we're talking about. And so you see, because it can easily be replaced with a noun performing the same grammatical function, it's an infinitive verb, it's not the main verb of the sentence. Nothing that you can replace with a noun without changing the grammatical structure of the sentence is ever going to be the main verb. Next, to find a subject and verb, again, always look for the verb first, because the core of that sentence is really the verb. The subject is whatever is performing the verb. So, Cecilia passed her geometry test. Well, we know that the verb here is passed, that's the action that's going on, and that is what tells us that it's not geometry test that's the subject, because it's not geometry test that did the passing. It's Cecilia. Good for Cecilia. This is really helpful when you come up with tricky subject-verb order inversions like the next sentence. Down the mountain charged the angry goat. Well, the action in this sentence is clearly the word charge. That must be our verb. But what did the charging? Oh dear, it would be the goat, the very last word of the sentence. Even though subjects normally come before verbs, as I've said, sometimes we invert the order just to be poetic or to mess with people. Down the mountain is actually a prepositional phrase, so it's never going to have the subject in it. All right, next. It is possible to have multiple verbs in one sentence, just as it's possible to have multiple subjects. In fact, you can have multiple subjects and multiple verbs and multiple subject-verb pairs in a sentence. It's a crazy language. So, let's look at an example. I went home. I is the subject. I went home. I ate dinner. I studied grammar. And I fell asleep at my desk. Well, grammar's not that boring, but the point stands, it's totally fine to have multiple verbs performed by the same subject, or even by a compound subject, or even by different subjects. Is English crazy or what? All right. Now that I've confused you completely, well, I hope I haven't really, let's do a little bit of practice. Find the subject and the predicate in each sentence. Now remember, the predicate is the verb plus all the other words that hang out with it to make the complete predicate. Find the verb within each predicate. So you're looking for the subject, the verb, and the complete predicate that surrounds the verb. Let's take a look. In Treasure Island, Jim leaves home and meets up with the pirate Long John Silver. War of the Worlds is a science fiction novel about an alien invasion. I am reading Frankenstein for English class and taking notes on the most important passages. H.G. Wells and Jules Verne wrote many science fiction stories and are revered by fans today. Have you ever read Homer's Odyssey? Without Charles Dickens, the modern novel would not be the same. And finally, my favorite author is Jane Austen. Take a good look. Pause the video if you need to. Have you found the subjects, the predicates, and the verbs within the predicates? Here we go. All right, here are the answers. In these sentences, the subjects are marked in red, the verbs are marked in blue, and the complete predicates are underlined. So, in Treasure Island, Jim is our subject, and what does he do? He leaves home. That's his main action, and he meets, that one should have been blue, up with the pirate Long John Silver. So Jim does two things. He leaves home, and he meets up with Long John Silver. Next. War of the Worlds. That whole book title right there is a proper noun. It's referring to the title of a book, so that's going to be our subject. What does it do? It is a science fiction novel. That's the only verb. About an alien invasion is a prepositional phrase, so you knew you weren't going to find the main verb there. Next, I is the subject, am reading is the verb, Frankenstein, direct object for English class, and taking, our second verb, notes on the most important passages. On the most important passages, prepositional phrase. Next, H.G. Wells, subject, and Jules Verne. So we have two subjects in one sentence. They wrote many science fiction stories, and they are revered by fans today. So they're performing two actions, two subjects who, as a group, did two things. They wrote, and they are revered. Next, have you ever read Homer's Odyssey? You is our subject. Have read, one of those broken up verb phrases that you sometimes find in questions. But what's this ever doing in here? Well, ever is an adverb. It's not actually part of the verb. It's modifying the verb. It's adding extra detail. It's describing the verb. So you can stick it in the middle of a verb phrase, although some people think it's kind of rude to do so. However, there's no other way to do it in a question, so there you go. Next, without Charles Dickens, that would be a prepositional phrase, so you know that's not going to be the subject of the verb. The modern novel, there's our simple subject, would not be the same. Not is another adverb, and it is pretty much always stuck in the middle of a verb phrase because that's where it has to go to negate the action of the verb, to turn would be into would not be. So whenever you see not or no, it's an adverb. Don't be fooled. It's not going to be part of the main verb, although it pretty much has to be part of the predicate. Next, my favorite author, subject, is your verb. That's a state of being. Jane Austen. So your total predicate is Jane Austen. And that's all for this lesson. Thank you for watching. Educator.com.